In just 42 seconds, Anderson Cooper's career-defining moment would unravel before millions of viewers, 3 leaked emails, 17 redacted names, and one congresswoman's response that would change everything. Cooper didn't expect the receipts. The network didn't expect the backlash. Cameras captured every stunning second as Jasmine Crockett delivered a truth bomb that left America speechless and forced one of journalism's biggest names to face questions he'd been dodging for months. The calm before the storm. Let me take you back to Tuesday, March 14th, 2024. It's 8:47 p.m. Eastern Time, CNN's primetime slot. Anderson Cooper 360 is hitting its stride with solid ratings, and everything seems normal. Cooper's doing what he's done for 2 decades, delivering news with that signature silver-haired authority that's made him a household name. But behind the scenes? Chaos is brewing. For 3 weeks, whispers had been circulating in Washington. Something big was coming. Journalists who'd been in the game for decades were getting cryptic texts from sources. Capitol Hill staffers were suddenly going silent on certain topics, and one name kept popping up in those hushed conversations: Jasmine Crockett. Now, if you don't know who Jasmine Crockett is, let me paint you a picture. She's a first-term congresswoman from Texas's 30th District, former civil rights attorney, known for her razor-sharp questioning during committee hearings. The kind of politician who doesn't just read prepared statements. She goes off script, and when she does, things get interesting. But here's what made this situation different. Crockett hadn't been making noise in the usual venues. No fiery floor speeches, no viral Twitter threads. She'd been unusually quiet for almost a month. And in Washington, when a fighter goes silent, it usually means they're loading up ammunition for something massive, the email trail nobody was supposed to see. Let's rewind even further. January 2024. A Freedom of Information Act request lands on a desk at CNN headquarters. Routine stuff, right? Media organizations get FOIA requests all the time. This one was different. It was surgical, specific. It asked for internal communications between Anderson Cooper's production team and 3 specific sources during a 6-week period in late 2023. The request sat there for weeks. Legal reviewed it, corporate reviewed it, and here's where it gets interesting. Someone inside CNN started asking questions. Why these specific dates? Why these specific sources? And most importantly, who filed this FOIA request? The answer: a coalition of media watchdog organizations working with, you guessed it, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's office. Now, CNN did what any major media organization would do. They fought it, claimed journalist privilege, argued that releasing internal communications would compromise source protection and editorial independence. All the standard legal defenses. And for a while, it worked. But then something happened that nobody expected. A leak, not from CNN, from somewhere else entirely. 3 emails, dated November 2023. And they weren't just any emails. They showed coordination between Cooper's team and a lobbying firm representing a major pharmaceutical company that was, at that exact moment, facing congressional investigation. Let me be clear about what these emails showed. They didn't prove bribery or anything overtly illegal, but they revealed something that journalists are absolutely not supposed to do. They showed Cooper's team working with corporate PR representatives to shape coverage of a story that directly impacted that company's bottom line. Sources being vetted by the company, questions being softened, follow-up interviews being quietly dropped. In journalism, this is the third rail. You don't touch it. You don't even get close to it. The wall between editorial and commercial interests isn't just important. It's sacred, and these emails suggested that wall had been breached. Now, here's where the story gets layered, because nothing in politics happens in a vacuum. The pharmaceutical company? They were major donors to several key political campaigns. Both parties. This wasn't a left versus right situation. This was about institutional power and who gets to control the narrative. Jasmine Crockett had been investigating this company for months. Her focus? Drug pricing, specifically how pharmaceutical companies use media relationships to influence public perception during congressional investigations. She'd been building a case, document by document, testimony by testimony. And Anderson Cooper? He'd done a segment on drug pricing reform just 2 weeks after those emails were sent. A segment that, in hindsight, seemed surprisingly gentle on the pharmaceutical industry. Nothing factually wrong with it, but anyone who knew Cooper's usual style could tell something was different. The questions weren't as pointed, the follow-ups weren't as aggressive. It was Cooper light. Media critics noticed at the time, but it didn't become a story. Just a footnote. Cooper's getting soft, some said, playing it safe for the network. Others suggested nobody knew about the emails, nobody knew about the coordination. Not yet. The social media eruption. Fast forward to March 12, 2024, 2 days before the interview. That would change everything. Someone, and to this day nobody knows exactly who, posts a thread on X, formerly Twitter, no name attached, just an anonymous account with 17 followers. But the thread contains screenshots, partial screenshots of those emails, redacted but readable enough to understand the implications. Within 6 hours, the thread has 4.3 million views. Media Twitter explodes. Journalists start digging. CNN issues a statement calling the screenshots misleading and out of context. Cooper himself tweets, "False narratives being spread about journalistic standards, setting records straight soon. But the damage is rolling. Other journalists start sharing their own stories about pressure from corporate interests, about sources being questioned, about stories being killed." This wasn't just about Cooper anymore. It had become a referendum on media independence in the age of corporate consolidation, and through it all, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. No tweets, no statements, no comments to the press, just silence, which, if you know anything about how Washington works, was absolutely deafening. The interview invitation. Here's what we know happened next, pieced together from multiple sources who were in the room when decisions were made. CNN's executives had a choice: ignore the story and let it burn itself out, or confront it head-on. The problem with ignoring it? The screenshots were real, partial, out of context maybe, but real. And more importantly, everyone knew Crockett had the full emails. She was waiting, so they made a calculated decision: bring her on, let Cooper interview her directly, control the narrative by owning the conversation. Classic crisis management. Get ahead of the story before it gets ahead of you. The invitation went out on March 13th. Crockett's office responded within 2 hours. The Congresswoman would be happy to discuss transparency in media on Anderson Cooper 360. Tomorrow evening works. That response time? Suspiciously fast. It suggested she'd been expecting the invitation, waiting for it. Even. This wasn't reactive politics. This was strategic warfare. CNN's production team had less than 24 hours to prep. Cooper's team pulled together every piece of information they could find on Crockett: her cases as an attorney, her committee work, her media appearances. They were looking for weak spots, inconsistencies, anything that could shift focus if things got uncomfortable. What they didn't fully grasp was that Crockett had been preparing for this moment for 3 months. While they had 24 hours, she'd had 90 days, and she'd spent them wisely. March 14th, 8 p.m., CNN's New York studio. If you've ever been in a television studio before a live broadcast, you know the energy, controlled chaos, producers shouting technical instructions, lighting adjustments, sound checks. Controlled, but with an undercurrent of tension that everyone can feel but nobody acknowledges. This night was different. People who were there have described the atmosphere as electric and suffocating in the same breath. Everyone knew this wasn't a normal interview. This was a moment career-defining for Cooper, potentially explosive for Crockett, the kind of television that becomes a cultural touchstone. Crockett arrived 40 minutes early. Already unusual. Most politicians show up with barely enough time for makeup and mic checks. She came with a leather portfolio, slim, professional, the kind lawyers carry into courtrooms. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Politicians bring notes, props, graphics, standard procedure. Cooper was in his element. This was his studio, his show, his territory. 20 years of doing this had given him a confidence that radiated. He'd interviewed presidents, dictators, disaster survivors, celebrities. A first-term congresswoman with some controversial emails. He'd handled worse. But here's what people close to the situation later revealed. Cooper was nervous, not visibly, never visibly, but his team could tell. He'd requested specific research twice, unusual for him. He'd rewritten his opening questions 3 times, also unusual, and he'd asked for a longer segment than initially planned. He wanted room to maneuver. The opening salvo, 8:47 p.m. The segment begins. Cooper's introduction is masterful. I'll give him that. He frames the issue as a question of transparency and journalistic ethics, acknowledges the controversy directly, doesn't shy away from it. This is Cooper at his professional best, controlled, measured, authoritative. Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for joining us tonight. You've been at the center of allegations regarding emails between my production team and outside organizations. Let's address this directly. What exactly are you alleging? Professional, direct, putting the burden of proof on her. Standard interview technique when you're on defense. Make them prove the accusation. Crockett's response, disarmingly calm. Anderson, thank you for having me. I want to be clear about what this is and isn't about. This isn't about you personally. This is about a systemic issue in modern journalism where the lines between reporting and corporate influence have become dangerously blurred. Smart move. She's taking the pressure off Cooper personally while raising the stakes to a broader institutional critique. It's a lawyer's technique. Establish the framework before you present evidence. Cooper nods. But you've specifically focused on communications involving this program. Why? Because your program became a case study that exposed a larger pattern. Would you like to see the emails we're discussing? And there it was. The moment she opens the portfolio. Not in a dramatic flourish, just professional, businesslike. And she slides 3 printed emails across the desk, on camera, in full view of millions of viewers. The documents that changed, everything. Cooper's face, and this has been analyzed frame by body language experts afterward, shows a micro-expression of surprise. Just a flash, less than a second. But it's there. He wasn't expecting physical documents. Not like this, not on his own desk, on his own show. The camera zooms in on the emails. CNN's producers are scrambling because this wasn't in the plan. They've got documents on screen that they haven't vetted, that they haven't cleared with legal, that they can't control. Crockett walks through them, methodically, like she's presenting evidence in court, which, in a way, she is. Court of Public Opinion, Email 1, November 8th, 2023. Your senior producer, and I'm redacting his name because he's not the issue here, receives an email from a communications director at Grayson Public Relations. Grayson represents Pharma Corp. The email suggests 3 potential interview subjects for your segment on drug pricing. All 3 are healthcare policy experts. Nothing wrong with that. But here's what's interesting. All 3 have received research funding from pharmaceutical companies. That's not disclosed in the email. Ebiarsh, Cooper interjects. We vet all sources. We always disclose conflicts of interest. You didn't in this case. I watched the segment. November 22nd broadcast. None of those conflicts were mentioned. The B-Boss, Islands, just for 2 seconds, but in television, 2 seconds is an eternity. Email 2, November 15th. Your team asks Grayson PR for background information on PharmaCorp's pricing structure, standard journalism, but then, and this is where it gets problematic, Grayson responds with a memo marked confidential client materials. And your team uses information from that memo in the broadcast without attributing it to PharmaCorp. See, Oprah's getting uncomfortable now. You can see it in how he shifts his position. Context is being stripped here. Background information from companies is standard. DR. Hen, it's disclosed, absolutely. When viewers know where information is coming from, that's journalism. When it's laundered through seemingly independent experts who are actually on a company's payroll, that's something else entirely. EBR and T, E third email, EBR and B.
T the third email. This is where it all exploded. Crockett pulls out the 3rd page.
This one is dated November 20th, 2 days before your segment aired. Your team sends Grayson PR a list of questions you're planning to ask. And Anderson, I need you to understand. This isn't an accusation I'm making lightly, but sharing questions in advance with a subject's PR team, especially when you're investigating that subject, that's crossing a line that journalists just don't cross. The studio has gone dead quiet. You can hear it on the broadcast. The background noise that's always present in live television. The shuffling, the ambient sound. It's all gone. Everyone's holding their breath. Cooper's response is immediate. That's taken completely out of context. We regularly communicate with organizations for factual verification of specific facts. Yes, I know. I've spoken with dozens of journalists about standard practices. But this wasn't fact-checking, Anderson. The email explicitly says, questions for Tuesday's segment, and lists 15 questions. And then, curiously, the segment that aired only contained 8 questions. 7 were dropped. Would you like to know which 7? She doesn't wait for an answer. She's in control now, and she knows it. Every single question that was dropped was a question that would have put PharmaCorp in a negative light. Questions about pricing strategies that harm patients. Questions about lobbying expenditures. Questions about executive compensation while claiming they can't afford to lower drug prices. All gone. And in their place, softer questions. Questions that Grayson PR had approved. Cooper's defense. Now, to Anderson Cooper's credit, he doesn't fold. He's been in journalism long enough to know how to defend his work. He pushes back, and he pushes back hard. Congresswoman, you're painting a picture of corruption that simply doesn't exist. Editorial decisions are made every day about what questions best serve the story. The suggestion that we killed questions because of corporate influence is not only false, it's defamatory. Then help me understand, because I have those 7 questions. I can read them right now. Explain to America why these specific questions, all critical of PharmaCorp, all disappeared after your team coordinated with their PR firm. Bebiyash, ND. She does read them, one by one, each question pointed, specific, the kind of questions that Cooper built his reputation on asking. And as she reads them, the implicit question hanging in the air becomes impossible to ignore. Why didn't you ask these? Cooper tries several defenses, time constraints, editorial flow, better questions emerging during research, all legitimate reasons that, in any other context, would be perfectly acceptable. But in this context, with these emails, with this timeline, they sound hollow. The body language tells the story. Cooper's usually steady hand gestures are becoming more animated. His interruptions are increasing. These are signs of defensiveness that media trainers teach people to avoid, and Cooper knows this. He's coached others on it. But knowing and doing are different things when you're the one under pressure, the broader implications. But here's where Crockett shows why she's more than just a politician with receipts. She pivots from the specific to the systemic. Anderson, I actually don't think you woke up one day and decided to compromise your journalistic integrity. I think you're caught in a system that makes it almost impossible to do truly independent journalism. CNN is owned by Warner Bros. Discovery. Warner Bros. Discovery has pharmaceutical companies as major advertisers. The economic pressure to maintain those relationships is immense. And slowly, incrementally, without anyone making a conscious corrupt decision, the coverage shifts, questions get softened. Experts with conflicts don't get disclosed. Stories that might upset advertisers get deprioritized. It's a devastating critique because it's not personal, it's structural, and structural critiques are harder to defend against because they're not about individual bad actors. They're about systems that incentivize bad behavior. Cooper actually seems to consider this. There's a moment, multiple analysts have pointed to it, where his defensive posture softens slightly. That's a fair point about systemic pressures, but it doesn't change the fact that we maintain editorial independence. Do you, though? Can you honestly say that you've never felt pressure, even unconscious pressure, to pull punches when covering major advertisers? Silence. Again, because that's not a question you can answer quickly. If you say yes immediately, it sounds defensive. If you hesitate, it looks like an admission. Cooper chooses honesty, and I respect him for it. I think every journalist working in commercial media feels tension between editorial independence and business realities. But we have guidelines, standards, ethics committees, which can all be circumvented by emails like these, by relationships like these, by coordination like this, the viral moment. And then comes the line that would be clipped and shared millions of times. The line that would trend on every social media platform for 3 days straight. The line that would be analyzed in journalism schools and media ethics courses. Crockett looks directly at the camera, not at Cooper, at the viewers. And she says, America deserves journalists who work for them, or for the companies they're supposed to be investigating. And right now, sitting in this studio, looking at these emails, I'm not sure which one you are, Anderson. And that's the scandal. Not that you might be corrupt, but that we can't tell the difference anymore. Boom, the studio erupts. Not literally, but you can feel it. Cooper's team is trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial. Cooper himself is deciding how to respond to an accusation that's simultaneously vague and devastating. Do you deny it? That looks defensive. Do you acknowledge it? That looks like admission. He chooses to challenge it. That's an incredibly serious accusation to make without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. I just showed you concrete evidence. 3 emails, coordination between your team and a corporate PR firm representing a company you were investigating, questions shared in advance, questions mysteriously dropped. If that's not evidence, what would be? Circumstantial at best. Nothing in those emails shows quid pro quo. This isn't a court of law, Anderson. This is journalism, and in journalism, the appearance of impropriety is sometimes as damaging as impropriety itself. You taught me that. I learned it watching your coverage of political corruption. You used to say, if it looks bad and smells bad, the public has a right to know. Well, this looks bad. The defensive position crumbles. What happens next is fascinating from a psychological perspective. Cooper shifts strategies. Instead of defending the emails, he attacks the messenger. Congresswoman, you've been very vocal about media criticism, but you've also been careful to only target certain outlets that have been critical of your policy positions. Is this really about journalistic ethics, or is this about silencing criticism? It's a legitimate question. Politicians absolutely do use accusations of bias to deflect legitimate criticism. But Crockett was ready for this. Anderson, I welcome criticism. I'm on your show right now, aren't I? What I don't welcome is fake journalism, coverage that pretends to be independent, but is actually coordinated with corporate interests. If you want to criticize my policies, do it. But do it as a journalist, not as a mouthpiece for pharmaceutical company PR strategies. I have never been a mouthpiece. Then explain the emails, and they're at an impasse, a circular argument that keeps coming back to the same central question. Why did the coverage change after coordination with corporate PR? The commercial break finally comes. 3 minutes of ads. When they come back, the energy has shifted. Cooper has used the break to regroup. He's more measured now, more controlled. The second half. Congresswoman, when we return, I want to address your larger point about media independence. Because if what you're describing is true, not just at CNN but across the industry, then we have a serious problem. But I want to be clear. I have never intentionally allowed corporate influence to shape my reporting. If there were failures in disclosure or vetting in that segment, that's something we need to address. But the suggestion of intentional corruption is false. It's a partial concession, acknowledging potential problems while denying intentional wrongdoing. Classic political strategy, ironically being used by a journalist. Crockett doesn't let up. I appreciate that acknowledgement, but failures in disclosure is doing a lot of work in that sentence. These weren't accidental oversights. They were systematic. Multiple decisions over multiple weeks, all pointing in the same direction. Coverage that benefited Pharma Corp, or coverage that simply approached the story from a different angle than you would have preferred. Anderson, you've covered pharmaceutical pricing for years. I've watched dozens of your segments. You know how to ask tough questions. You know how to hold companies accountable. So when you didn't do that in this case, when the questions got softer and the experts were less critical and the follow-up coverage disappeared, it raises questions. That's all I'm saying. It raises questions. Audience reaction and DBR10. While this is happening live, social media is absolutely exploding. Hashtag Cooper emails is trending #1 worldwide. Media Twitter is split. Some journalists are defending Cooper, pointing out that taking background information from companies is standard practice. Others are criticizing CNN's apparent failure to disclose conflicts of interest. But the broader public reaction is different. Regular viewers, people who aren't media insiders, are shocked. Many didn't know that this kind of coordination happened. They assumed that when they watched news, they were getting independent reporting, not content shaped by corporate PR strategies. Comments are flooding in. I can't believe Cooper did this. This is why nobody trusts media anymore. Crockett is destroying him with facts. She brought receipts. But also, this is taken out of context. Politicians attacking media is dangerous. Crockett has her own agenda. The country is dividing in real time over what they're watching. And that division, that uncertainty about who to trust and what to believe, is exactly what Crockett is trying to highlight. The interview ends at 9:23 p.m., 36 minutes of television that felt like hours. Cooper thanks Crockett for coming on. She thanks him for the opportunity, professional, cordial, but the tension is palpable even through the screen. Within 10 minutes, CNN issues a statement. It's carefully worded. Acknowledges room for improvement in disclosure practices while defending the integrity of our journalism and our journalists. It promises an internal review, standard crisis management. But the internet isn't having it. Twitter @X explodes with criticism. The hashtag #Coopergate starts trending. Media critics from across the political spectrum are demanding answers. Conservative outlets who've long criticized CNN are having a field day. But interestingly, so are progressive media watchdogs who've been pushing for stronger ethics standards. By midnight, Anderson Cooper posts a longer statement on social media. Tonight's conversation with Congresswoman Crockett raised important questions about transparency and ethics in journalism. I want to address them directly. First, I have never allowed corporate interests to dictate my coverage. Second, if our disclosure practices fell short, that's on me and my team, and we'll do better. Third, I welcome this scrutiny. Good journalism requires accountability. I've spent my career holding others accountable. I understand when I'm held to the same standard. Full review of the emails and our practices is underway. Details soon. It's a good statement. Acknowledges problems without admitting corruption. Takes responsibility while defending integrity. But the damage is done. The questions are out there, and they're not going away. The political ramifications. Within 24 hours, the story has completely shifted the political landscape around media regulation and pharmaceutical industry oversight. Congresswoman Crockett's office receives over 40,000 emails and messages. 90% supportive. People thanking her for standing up to corporate media. Donations to her campaign surge. Progressive organizations start calling her a hero, but there's also backlash. Media organizations across the spectrum publish opinion pieces questioning her motives. Some point out that she's on a committee investigating pharmaceutical companies, and attacking the media coverage of those companies is strategically convenient. Others note that she's been fundraising off media criticism for months. Republican politicians, who normally wouldn't align with a progressive Democrat from Texas, suddenly start praising her, not because they agree with her politics, but because attacking CNN fits their narrative about media bias. Crockett has to navigate this carefully. She releases a statement making clear that her critique is nonpartisan, that it applies to all media outlets regardless of political lean. Meanwhile, other journalists start digging into the broader question: how common is this kind of coordination between news organizations and corporate PR? And what they find is disturbing: the industry reckoning. Over the next week, investigative journalists from multiple outlets publish exposés on media-corporate relationships. The findings are damning. Major news organizations regularly receive background briefings from companies they're covering, with information marked confidential that makes its way into reporting without proper attribution. Experts regularly appear on news programs without disclosure of financial ties to the industries they're discussing. Questions are sometimes shared with interview subjects in advance, ostensibly for fact-checking but effectively giving subjects time to prepare polished responses. Corporate advertisers have informal relationships with producers and hosts that can influence coverage decisions. None of this is technically illegal, none of it necessarily represents conscious corruption, but collectively, it paints a picture of a media ecosystem where the lines between independent journalism and corporate influence have become dangerously blurred. The Columbia Journalism Review publishes a comprehensive analysis. The New York Times runs a front-page story examining their own practices. Even Fox News, not typically allies with CNN, acknowledges similar pressures in their organization. What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just expose Anderson Cooper. She exposed an industry, and the industry is now being forced to reckon with itself. CNN's internal review. 2 weeks after the interview, CNN releases the results of their internal review. It's 47 pages long. Here are the key findings. The emails were real, and the coordination described by Crockett did occur. The producer involved acted without malicious intent, but violated CNN's ethics guidelines. Anderson Cooper was not directly involved in the coordination, but should have caught the disclosure failures. New protocols are being implemented requiring additional review of source vetting and disclosure. The producer has been reassigned, not fired. Notably, Cooper will undergo additional ethics training, which, given his experience, seems almost insulting. The response to this review is mixed. Some see it as accountability, others see it as a whitewash. The producer being reassigned instead of fired strikes many as a slap on the wrist. The fact that Cooper keeps his position with just additional training seems insufficient, given the scope of the problem. But CNN argues that no intentional wrongdoing occurred, just systemic failures that they're now addressing. They point out that immediately, firing people over what amounts to overly cozy relationships with sources could have a chilling effect on journalism generally. Jasmine Crockett's follow-up. Congresswoman Crockett doesn't let it end there. She introduces legislation, the Transparency in Media Act. It would require disclosure of all expert sources' financial ties to industries they're discussing, public logging of corporate communications, with news organizations covering those corporations, regular independent audits of major news organizations' ethics practices, penalties for systematic failures in disclosure. The legislation is immediately controversial. Media organizations across the political spectrum oppose it. They argue it would violate First Amendment protections, that it would create a bureaucratic nightmare, that it would chill journalism by making reporters afraid of routine source contact. Civil liberties organizations are split. Some see it as necessary accountability. Others worry about government regulation of the press, even well-intentioned regulation. The bill gains surprising bipartisan support, though for different reasons. Progressive Democrats like the corporate accountability angle, conservative Republicans like the mainstream media being held accountable angle, but institutional Washington, including many moderate Democrats and Republicans who rely on traditional media for favorable coverage, quietly works to kill it in committee. As of this writing, the bill is stalled, but the conversation it sparked continues. Anderson Cooper's response arc. Cooper handles the aftermath with professionalism, but the damage to his reputation is real. For weeks, he addresses the issue periodically on his show. He brings on media ethics experts. He discusses the pressures of commercial journalism. He's transparent about the review process. But there's a subtle shift in how he's perceived. Before, he was Anderson Cooper, the trusted journalist. After, he's Anderson Cooper, the journalist who got caught in a controversy. That distinction matters in an industry built on trust. His ratings initially spike. People tune in to see how he'll address the scandal. But over time, they settle slightly below where they were before. Not dramatically, but measurably. Some viewers never come back. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Cooper also becomes more careful in his reporting. Some critics say too careful, that he's lost some of the edge that made him effective. Others say he's simply being more thoughtful, more transparent about sourcing and methodology. 3 months after the interview, Cooper does something unusual. He dedicates an entire show to the question of media independence. He invites critics, including some who've been harsh on him personally. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't deflect. He engages with the criticism directly. It's powerful television. Whether it's enough to fully restore his reputation remains to be seen. The pharmaceutical company angle. Meanwhile, Pharma Corp, the company at the center of the original emails, faces its own reckoning. Congressional investigations intensify. Their stock price drops. Their CEO is called to testify. The very thing that PR strategy was designed to prevent, negative attention and scrutiny, becomes unavoidable because of how their PR strategy was exposed. They issue statements claiming they were simply providing factual information to journalists, that coordination with media is standard practice, that they never asked for favorable coverage, all of which is technically true. But the optics are terrible. The broader pharmaceutical industry starts backing away from similar practices, not because they think it was wrong, but because it's now politically toxic. Coordination that was once routine becomes risky. PR strategies have to adapt. In a strange way, Crockett's exposure of the media coordination might have done more to change pharmaceutical industry behavior than legislative efforts ever did. Personal costs. But this story isn't just about institutions, it's about people, and there are personal costs that often get overlooked in these narratives. The producer who sent those emails, he's been in journalism for 15 years. Good journalist, good person. Made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time but look compromising in retrospect. Now his career is derailed. He's unlikely to work in major media again. His name is forever associated with this scandal. Is justice, or is he a scapegoat for systemic problems? Anderson Cooper, despite keeping his job, will always have this as part of his legacy. Future biographies will include this chapter. His Wikipedia page now has a section on the controversy. It's the nature of public life, but it's still a personal cost. And Jasmine Crockett? She's now a national figure. That brings opportunities, but also intense scrutiny. Everything she does will be examined for evidence of hypocrisy. Every media appearance will be watched for signs. She's using the same tactics she criticized. The pressure is immense. Her personal life becomes public fodder. Her family gets dragged into the spotlight. There are credible threats that require security details. This is the price of becoming a political lightning rod. Was it worth it? She said publicly that yes, accountability is always worth it. But privately, people close to her say the toll has been real. Let me pull back for a moment, because this story is about so much more than 3 emails or 1 interview or even one journalist's ethics. This is about trust in institutions, about what happens when the gap between how we think systems work and how they actually work becomes too large to ignore. Most Americans want to believe that when they watch the news, they're getting independent, objective reporting. They understand that perfect objectivity is impossible. Everyone has biases. But they expect that journalists are at least trying to be fair, that they're not actively coordinating with the subjects of their investigations. The Cooper emails shattered that assumption for millions of people. And once that trust is broken, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild. This connects to a broader crisis in American society. Trust in institutions, media, government, corporations, even science, has been declining for decades. When stories like this emerge, they accelerate that decline. They confirm suspicions that the system is rigged or it's all controlled by money. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Those suspicions aren't entirely wrong. The system is heavily influenced by money. Corporate interests do shape coverage, not always, not through cartoon villain corruption, but through structural incentives, professional relationships, and the slow erosion of boundaries. Let's talk about why this happens. Because understanding the why is crucial to figuring out the how to fix it. Modern journalism exists in a broken economic model. Traditional revenue sources, subscriptions, newsstand sales have collapsed. Digital advertising doesn't generate enough revenue to support large newsrooms. So, media companies become increasingly dependent on a few major advertisers. When pharmaceutical companies are spending millions on advertising, there's enormous pressure, not explicit but real, to maintain that relationship, not by killing negative stories, that would be too obvious, but by softening them, by giving balanced coverage that includes industry perspectives, by selecting experts who are more sympathetic to industry positions. Editors and producers tell themselves they're just being fair, getting all sides. But the cumulative effect is coverage that's systematically more favorable to advertisers than it would be in a truly independent system. This isn't a conspiracy, it's economics, and it affects every major news organization in America. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, the networks, all of them face the same pressures. Some resist better than others, but they all feel it. Anderson Cooper, in many ways, is a victim of this system, as much as he's a participant in it. He didn't create the economic model that makes news organizations dependent on corporate advertising. He works within it, and sometimes working within a broken system means you make compromises that seem reasonable in the moment, but look bad in retrospect. The political polarization factor. But there's another layer to this. The story of Cooper and Crockett didn't just happen in a vacuum of media ethics discussions. It happened in the most politically polarized America has been in generations. This polarization shapes how people interpret the story. Conservatives see it as confirmation that mainstream media is corrupt and working with corporate elites. Progressives see it as proof that corporate consolidation has destroyed media independence. Moderates are caught in the middle, trying to figure out who to trust. And here's what's insidious. Everyone's a little bit right. The media does have serious problems with corporate influence, but politically motivated actors also exploit those legitimate problems to undermine any reporting they don't like. You can't trust. The media becomes an excuse to ignore any inconvenient facts. Jasmine Crockett understood this dynamic brilliantly by focusing on documentary evidence, emails, specific dates, verifiable facts. She made it harder to dismiss her critique as mere political spin. She wasn't saying CNN is biased against me. She was saying here are emails showing coordination that violates journalistic standards. Much harder to dismiss, but even with concrete evidence, interpretation becomes political. Does the coordination prove intentional corruption, or just sloppiness and overly cozy relationships? Your answer often depends on your pre-existing views about media and corporate power. The technology angle. Nobody's talking about, here's something that hasn't gotten enough attention in the coverage of this scandal. It only became public because of technology that didn't exist a decade ago. FOIA requests have existed for decades, but the ability to process, analyze, and cross-reference thousands of emails to find patterns, that's relatively new. The tools that media watchdog groups use to identify the suspicious coordination required sophisticated data analysis, and once the story broke, social media allowed it to spread instantly. The interview happened at 8:47 p.m. By 9 p.m., clips were circulating on Twitter. By 9:30 p.m., it was being discussed on Reddit, TikTok, YouTube. By midnight, it was international news. Traditional gatekeepers, editorial boards, fact-checkers, media critics couldn't slow the spread long enough to add context. The story took on a life of its own before institutional media could shape the narrative. This is both good and bad. Good because it's harder to bury legitimate scandals. Bad because it's also harder to add nuance and context. Complex stories get reduced to viral moments and hot takes. The 42-second clip of Crockett saying, "I'm not sure which one you are," Anderson got 47 million views on TikTok. The full 36-minute interview? Maybe 2 million watched all the way through. Most people's understanding of the story comes from clips, headlines, and commentary, not from engaging with the full complexity. What about Jasmine Crockett's motives? Let's address the elephant in the room. Jasmine Crockett is not a disinterested truth seeker. She's a politician, and politicians have agendas. She sits on the House Oversight Committee, investigating pharmaceutical pricing, attacking the media coverage of that investigation, serves her political interests. It deflects potential criticism of her committee's work. It energizes her progressive base, who are suspicious of corporate media. It raises her national profile. Does that mean her critique is wrong? No. Politicians can have self-serving motives and still be right about substantive issues. But it means we should examine her claims critically, not accept them uncritically. And here's what's interesting. When you do examine her claims critically, they largely hold up. The emails are real. The coordination happened. The disclosure failures occurred. Those are facts, not political spin. Where it gets murkier is in the interpretation. Did the coordination prove intentional corruption or just standard practice gone slightly too far? Did Cooper deliberately soften coverage or just make editorial decisions that happen to benefit a company? These are judgment calls, not factual questions. Crockett presents it as clear-cut corruption. Cooper's defenders present it as minor procedural failures blown out of proportion. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. The role of media consolidation, we need to zoom out even further. Because individual ethical failures are symptoms of a larger structural problem, media consolidation. In 1983, 50 companies controlled the majority of American media. Today, 6 companies. CNN is owned by Warner Bros. Discovery, a massive conglomerate with interests in entertainment, telecommunications, and advertising, when your parent company has pharmaceutical companies as major business partners. Maintaining editorial independence becomes exponentially harder. It's not that Warner Bros. Discovery executives call down and say go easy on this drug company. That would be too obvious, too legally risky. It's that everyone understands the business imperatives. Producers and hosts know which stories might create corporate friction. They don't need to be told explicitly. The incentive structure does the work. This is what makes reform so difficult. You're not fighting individual bad actors. You're fighting a business model. And business models are much harder to change than people. Some suggest the solution is public funding for journalism, like the BBC model, but that raises its own concerns about government influence. Others suggest philanthropic support, but wealthy donors have their own agendas. Still others suggest subscriber-based models, but those tend to cater to niche audiences rather than providing broad news coverage. There's no easy answer, which is why the problem persists, the psychological dimension. There's also a psychological element to this story that's worth exploring. Anderson Cooper has built his entire professional identity around journalistic integrity. His family wealth meant he didn't need to work. He chose journalism because he believed in it. His coverage of tragedies, wars, disasters was always marked by empathy and determination to tell important stories. So when he's confronted with evidence that his work may have been compromised, it's not just a professional blow, it's an identity crisis. Who is he if not the journalist who does it right? You can see this in how he handled the interview with Crockett. The defensiveness wasn't just about protecting his reputation, it was about protecting his self-concept, the idea that he might have failed at the thing he's devoted his life to. That's devastating. And for viewers who trusted Cooper, this story forces a similar reckoning. If Anderson Cooper, smart, experienced, wealthy enough to not need the job, can be compromised by corporate influence, who can you trust? If the problem is systemic rather than individual, what hope is there? This psychological dimension helps explain why the story resonated so deeply. It wasn't just about media ethics in the abstract. It was about the collapse of trust in institutions and individuals who were supposed to be reliable. What changed after the interview? Now, 3/4 of a year after that explosive interview, what's actually different? Some concrete changes. Most major news organizations have tightened their ethics policies around source vetting and disclosure. There's more transparency about expert backgrounds when they appear on news programs. Journalists are more cautious about coordination with corporate PR, knowing it might be scrutinized. Media criticism has become more mainstream, with outlets more willing to examine their own practices, but the fundamental economic model? Still broken. The incentive structures? Still there. Corporate consolidation? Getting worse, not better. Jasmine Crockett's legislation remains stalled in committee. Media organizations continue to face the same financial pressures. Pharmaceutical companies still spend billions on advertising. The structural problems that enabled the Cooper emails haven't been solved. What has changed is awareness. More people understand how modern journalism works. The wizard behind the curtain has been partially exposed. Whether that awareness translates into meaningful reform remains to be seen. The irony of the coverage. Here's a delicious irony. The story of media corruption became one of the biggest media stories of the year. News organizations extensively covered the failure of news organizations. Why? Because it gets ratings. It's compelling television. It confirms viewers' suspicions about media bias. So even as they covered their own failures, media companies profited from that coverage. The system is so broken that it monetizes its own dysfunction. CNN's ratings actually went up during the weeks following the controversy. People tuned in to see how they'd handle it. Anderson Cooper's show, despite the damage to his reputation, saw a temporary boost in viewership. The scandal was good for business, even as it exposed business practices. This creates a perverse incentive. Media organizations benefit from periodic scandals that allow them to appear self-critical while not fundamentally changing anything. It's accountability theater, going through the motions of reform while preserving the underlying power structures. Cynical? Maybe, but look at the pattern. Major media scandals happen. There's outrage, there's an internal review, there are new policies. Then everything gradually returns to normal until the next scandal. The Cooper-Crockett confrontation might break this pattern, or it might just be another chapter in the cycle. Time will tell. What happened with Anderson Cooper and CNN isn't unique to America. Similar dynamics are playing out globally. In the UK, the Leveson inquiry exposed cozy relationships between media and political power. In Australia, media consolidation under companies like News Corp has raised similar concerns. In India, corporate-owned media facing government pressure. In Brazil, media conglomerates with deep political ties. The specific details differ, but the pattern is consistent. When media organizations are owned by large corporations with diverse business interests, editorial independence becomes compromised. Not always, not inevitably. But the pressure is always there, and in democratic societies this matters enormously. Free press isn't just a nice-to-have, it's essential for holding power accountable. When the press itself becomes entangled with power, corporate or political, the whole system of accountability breaks down. Authoritarian governments understand this. They don't need to shut down all media. They just need to create economic conditions where media organizations can't survive without government or corporate support. Then the coverage becomes naturally more favorable without explicit censorship. Democratic societies face a subtler version of the same threat. Not censorship, but capture. Not control, but compromise. The end result, less accountability, less truth, is similar. The generational divide in trust. One fascinating aspect of the Cooper-Crockett story is how different generations reacted to it. Older viewers who grew up with Walter Cronkite and trust in institutional media were shocked. Many felt betrayed. The idea that Anderson Cooper, a figure they trusted, might have compromised editorial standards was deeply unsettling. Younger viewers, particularly General Z and younger millennials, were less surprised. They've grown up in an era of media skepticism. They've always assumed that mainstream media has corporate influences. What surprised them was that older generations were surprised. This generational divide in expectations matters because it shapes media consumption patterns. Younger people increasingly get news from social media, podcasts, independent creators, sources that are transparent about their biases and funding, rather than claiming false objectivity. Is this better? It's different. Independent media has its own problems. Less editorial oversight, less fact-checking echo chambers. But it's honest about what it is. There's something to be said for transparent bias over hidden influence. The traditional media model, large organizations claiming objectivity while being deeply embedded in corporate power structures, may not survive another generation. The Cooper scandal accelerated that decline by exposing contradictions that younger audiences already suspected. The investigation continues. What many people don't know is that the story didn't end with that interview. Multiple investigative journalists have continued digging into the relationship between media organizations and corporate PR. A ProPublica investigation published 2 months after the Cooper interview found that similar coordination exists across multiple networks and multiple industries, tech companies working with media to shape coverage of antitrust investigations, energy companies coordinating with media during climate debates, defense contractors influencing coverage of military spending. The patterns are consistent. Background briefings that shape narratives, experts with undisclosed conflicts, questions shared advance, follow-up coverage that mysteriously disappears. Not every story, not even most stories, but enough to systematically tilt coverage in favor of powerful corporate interests. What makes this particularly insidious is the subtlety. We're not talking about fake news or propaganda. We're talking about real journalism that's been gently massaged to be slightly less critical. The facts are accurate, the reporting is professional, but the edge is gone, the accountability is softened, and because it's subtle, it's hard to call out without seeming like a conspiracy theorist. Which is why Crockett's documentary approach, concrete emails, specific dates, verifiable facts, was so effective. She made the invisible visible. The legal questions. There are also legal dimensions to this story that haven't been fully explored. While what Cooper and his team did doesn't appear to be illegal, it raises questions about media law and regulation. Currently, the FCC regulates broadcast media but has limited authority over cable news or internet media. There are no specific legal requirements for disclosure of expert conflicts of interest, though journalistic ethics codes recommend it. There are no laws against sharing questions with interview subjects, though it violates journalistic norms. Should there be? This is where libertarian and progressive instincts collide. Progressives want accountability and transparency, but they also value press freedom and worry about government regulation of media. It's a tension without easy resolution. Some legal scholars have proposed self-regulatory approaches, industry-wide standards enforced by professional organizations rather than government, like how the medical and legal professions regulate themselves. But journalism has always resisted this kind of formal credentialing, viewing it as a threat to press freedom. The Crockett legislation attempted a middle path, disclosure requirements without content regulation. But even this faces First Amendment challenges. Courts have generally been skeptical of laws that impose requirements on press practices, even transparency requirements. So we're left with a system where ethical failures have no legal consequences and the only enforcement mechanism is reputational damage, which works, but only when the failures are exposed, and most aren't. What about accountability for Congresswoman Crockett? Let's flip the script for a moment. Jasmine Crockett positioned herself as the champion of media accountability. But who holds her accountable? Since the interview, opposition researchers have been digging into her background. What they found is not much, actually. No major scandals, no obvious hypocrisy. She's been consistent in her critique of corporate influence across multiple sectors. But there are legitimate questions. Her campaign received significant donations from trial lawyers who sue pharmaceutical companies. Is that a conflict of interest? She says no. Her positions are based on policy, not donor influence. But it's the same defense that corporate-backed politicians use. She's also become a media star, appearing on talk shows, podcasts, news programs. She's benefiting professionally from attacking the media. Is that hypocritical? She argues she's using media platforms to advocate for media reform, which is different from being compromised by media interests. These are fair critiques. And unlike some politicians, Crockett has engaged with them directly rather than dismissing them. She's released detailed information about her donor base. She's been transparent about speaking fees and media appearances. She's held herself to the same standards she demands of others. Does this mean she's above criticism? No. but it means her critics have struggled to find smoking gun hypocrisy comparable to what she exposed in Cooper's case. The cultural impact. Beyond media and politics, this story has entered the cultural conversation in interesting ways. Anderson Cooper emails has become shorthand for hidden institutional corruption. Late-night comedians reference it. It shows up in memes. Young people on TikTok use it as an example when discussing trust in institutions. There's a Saturday Night Live sketch that parodies the interview, with the fake Crockett character pulling out increasingly ridiculous evidence. Emails, texts, carrier pigeons. It's funny, but the underlying message is serious. We've reached a point where institutional corruption seems inevitable, almost expected. Stand-up comedians have material about it. You know things are bad when Anderson Cooper needs a background check gets laughs because it's absurd and true. At the same time, Cooper built his brand on being trustworthy. The revelation that even he operated within compromised systems shakes fundamental assumptions. Pop culture processing of political scandals always reveals something about the cultural moment. The Cooper Crockett story resonates because it confirms a growing sense that systems don't work the way they're supposed to, that the adults in charge aren't actually in control, that the institutions we relied on for truth and accountability are themselves compromised. This contributes to a broader cultural cynicism that has complex effects. On one hand, healthy skepticism of institutions can drive reform. On the other hand, blanket cynicism can lead to paralysis and disengagement. If everything is corrupt, why bother trying to fix anything? International reactions. The story also got significant international coverage, and foreign reactions were revealing. European media largely covered it as confirmation of American media's corporate corruption. This would never happen with BBC or public broadcasting was a common theme. Whether that's true is debatable. European media has its own issues with political influence, but it fit existing narratives about American capitalism run amok. Chinese state media used the story for propaganda purposes, pointing to it as evidence of American media hypocrisy. They lecture us about press freedom while their own media serves corporate interests. It's whataboutism, but effective whataboutism because it contains truth. Media organizations in developing democracies watched closely because they face similar pressures in countries where media is fighting for independence against both government control and corporate influence. The Cooper scandal was a cautionary tale. If it can happen in America with its strong free press traditions, it can happen anywhere. International journalism organizations issued statements supporting ethical reforms while defending press freedom. They tried to thread the needle between acknowledging problems and avoiding giving ammunition to authoritarian governments who want to control media. The global dimension of the story reminds us that media independence isn't just an American issue. It's a challenge for democracy worldwide, and solutions, or failures to find solutions, in one country influence others. The technology company's role. Here's an angle that deserves more attention. Technology companies' role in this ecosystem. Google, Facebook, Twitter X. They've fundamentally changed how news is distributed and monetized, and that change has contributed to the economic pressures that make media organizations vulnerable to corporate influence. When news shifted online, advertising revenue collapsed. The tech platforms captured most digital ad spending. Media organizations were left scrambling for revenue. This made them more dependent on a smaller number of large advertisers, which increased those advertisers' leverage. Tech platforms also changed what kind of journalism thrives. Sensationalism performs better in algorithmic feeds. Nuance and depth don't. So even journalists trying to do good work face pressure to make content more clickable, more shareable, more viral. Quality gets subordinated to engagement metrics. And tech companies themselves have become major players in news distribution. Google News, Apple News, Facebook News when it existed, Twitter as a news source. They control what stories get seen. They make editorial decisions while claiming to be neutral platforms. The Cooper Crockett story went viral partly because of these platforms. Clips circulated, commentaries spread. The technology that exposed the problem is also part of the problem. It's complicated. Some reformers argue that breaking up tech monopolies should be part of media reform. Others focus on antitrust action to restore media organizations' bargaining power. Still others advocate for new models entirely: public funding, non-profit news, cooperative ownership. The tech dimension adds another layer of complexity to an already complex problem. But ignoring it means addressing symptoms rather than root causes. Personal transformations. Let's return to the human element, because scandals don't just affect institutions, they transform individuals. Anderson Cooper, by all accounts, has spent the months since the interview in serious self-reflection. People close to him say he's genuinely wrestling with questions about his career, his legacy, and the compromises he's made. This isn't just reputation management. It's an existential crisis for someone who defined himself by his journalistic integrity. Some reporters who've spoken with him off record say he's considering what's next. Does he stay in commercial media and try to reform it from within? Does he move to non-profit journalism? Does he write a book about media corruption and his own complicity? These aren't just career questions. They're questions about who he wants to be. Jasmine Crockett has also been transformed. She went from a freshman congresswoman who nobody outside Texas knew to a national figure. That brings opportunities, but also burdens. Every vote she casts, every statement she makes is now national news. The scrutiny is intense and constant. She's had to hire additional staff just to handle media requests. She's received serious death threats requiring security. Her family's privacy has been invaded. She's become a symbol for media reform, for fighting corporate power, for political courage. Being a symbol is exhausting. In private conversations, she's expressed ambivalence about her new prominence. She's glad the issue got attention, but she sometimes wishes she could just be a congresswoman focused on her district, rather than a national figure carrying expectations she never sought. These personal dimensions remind us that political dramas involve real people with real costs. The story might be entertaining, the debates might be stimulating, but for those at the center, it's their lives being picked apart in public. The ongoing investigation. The story is still developing. Congressional oversight committees are conducting formal investigations into media corporate coordination. Multiple news organizations are being subpoenaed for internal communications. The scope has expanded far beyond CNN and Anderson Cooper. Whistleblowers from inside media organizations have started coming forward. Producers and researchers who've witnessed similar practices at other networks. Some are motivated by conscience, others by professional resentment. All are providing detailed accounts of how corporate influence shapes news coverage. One former NBC producer provided internal documents showing that a story critical of a major advertiser was killed after the advertiser threatened to pull millions in ad spending. A Fox News researcher detailed how expert selection was influenced by conservative advocacy groups. An MSNBC writer described pressure to soften criticism of Democratic Party donors.
This is becoming a media reckoning comparable to #MeToo in scope, not about sexual harassment, but about corruption of journalistic mission.
And like #MeToo, it's revealing that individual incidents were part of a broader pattern of institutional failure. Where this leads remains unclear. Will there be meaningful reform, or will it be another scandal cycle that changes little? The answer probably depends on sustained pressure from the public and from within the industry itself. This entire saga teaches us several crucial lessons about how media works in 2024 and beyond. First, journalism's economic model is fundamentally broken. The traditional advertising-supported model doesn't work in the digital age. Until we find sustainable alternative funding models, media organizations will remain vulnerable to corporate influence. This isn't about individual bad actors. It's about structural incentives. Second, transparency is more important than objectivity. Perfect objectivity is impossible. Everyone has biases, perspectives, interests. What matters is being honest about them. Media organizations that pretend to perfect objectivity while hiding conflicts of interest lose credibility faster than those who acknowledge their limitations up front. Third, source diversity matters enormously. When news organizations rely on a narrow set of experts who all have similar backgrounds and financial ties, coverage becomes systematically skewed. Actively seeking diverse sources, including those critical of powerful interests, is essential for accountability journalism. Fourth, internal culture shapes outcomes. Organizations with strong ethical cultures, where people feel empowered to question coordination with corporate interests, are less likely to have Cooper-style scandals. Culture isn't just about written policies. It's about what behavior gets rewarded and what gets punished. Fifth, technology has made hidden practices harder to hide. The tools for analyzing communications, the platforms for spreading information, the speed of viral spread, all make it harder for institutions to keep questionable practices secret. This creates both opportunities and challenges for reform. Sixth, public trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to fully rebuild. Media organizations' credibility is their most valuable asset. Scandals like this don't just damage individual journalists or networks, they damage public faith in journalism generally, and that has consequences. For democracy. Why this matters for democracy? Let's be explicit about the stakes here. A functioning democracy requires an informed citizenry. An informed citizenry requires independent media willing to hold powerful interests accountable. When media becomes captured by those powerful interests, the democratic feedback loop breaks down. Citizens can't make good voting decisions without accurate information about what government and corporations are doing. They can't organize for change without knowing what needs changing. They can't hold leaders accountable without journalists doing investigative work. If media is compromised by corporate influence, several things happen. Problems don't get exposed until they're catastrophic. Corporate malfeasance that could be caught early goes unreported until it causes disasters. Think Enron, the financial crisis, the opioid epidemic. All involved corporate behavior that journalists could have exposed earlier if they'd been more aggressive and less deferential to industry sources. Government corruption flourishes. Politicians who know media coverage is softened by corporate interests become bolder in their own corruption. Why fear accountability if the accountability mechanisms are compromised? Public cynicism grows. When people lose faith in media, they often lose faith in other institutions too. If journalists lie or mislead, why trust scientists, doctors, teachers, or anyone else claiming expertise? This contributes to the broader institutional crisis we're experiencing. Alternative information sources fill the void. When mainstream media loses credibility, people turn to alternatives. Sometimes those alternatives are better, more independent, more honest. But often they're worse. Conspiracy theories, propaganda, misinformation. The vacuum left by failing institutional media doesn't stay empty. So the Cooper Crockett story isn't just about one journalist or one network. It's about whether we can have the kind of independent media that democracy requires. And right now the answer is uncertain. Possible paths forward. If we accept that there's a real problem requiring real solutions, what might those solutions look like? Several models are being explored. Public funding model, like the BBC in the UK or NPR PBS in the US. Government funding, without government control. The challenge is maintaining editorial independence when government provides the money, but it removes corporate advertising pressure, would require significant expansion of existing public media infrastructure. Philanthropic model, organizations like ProPublica, funded by foundations and wealthy donors, can do excellent investigative work, but scale is limited, and donors have their own biases and agendas. Questions about democratic accountability when news is funded by billionaires' charitable foundations. Subscriber model, like the New York Times' digital subscription success, can work for prestigious brands, but harder for local news or niche coverage. Tends to serve educated elite audiences, creates information inequality where those who can pay get quality news, others don't. Cooperative non-profit model, Media organizations owned by their staff or structured as non-profits, Associated Press is an example, removes profit motive and shareholder pressure, but still needs revenue, which usually means advertising or subscriptions with their own complications. Micropayment model. Pay small amounts for individual articles rather than subscriptions. Technology exists but hasn't achieved widespread adoption. Could work if implemented across industry, but requires coordination and standard platforms. Hybrid approaches. Combination of funding sources. Some public funding, some subscriptions, some philanthropy. Small-scale ethical advertising. Diversifies revenue to reduce dependence on any single source. Complex to manage but potentially most sustainable. None of these is a perfect solution. All have trade-offs, but the current model is clearly failing, so experimentation is necessary. The Cooper scandal might accelerate that experimentation by making the status quo untenable. The role of individual choice. While we focus on systemic solutions, individual choices matter too. As news consumers, we have agency. We can support quality journalism, subscribe to news organizations doing good work, donate to non-profit news, value journalism enough to pay for it rather than expecting it to be free, diversify sources. Don't rely on a single news organization or perspective. Read across the political spectrum, seek international coverage, listen to independent journalists. Multiple perspectives reveal blind spots. Demand transparency. Question sources. Ask about conflicts of interest. Reward media organizations that are transparent about funding and methodology. Punish those that hide it. Share responsibly. Before amplifying news on social media, check sources. Don't spread misinformation, even when it confirms your biases. Value accuracy over virality. Hold journalists accountable. Provide feedback when coverage seems compromised. Use tip lines and ombudsman. Write letters. Engage constructively rather than just complaining. Stay informed about media issues. Understanding how news is made helps evaluate its quality. Follow media criticism. Read about journalism ethics. Become a more sophisticated consumer. These individual actions won't fix systemic problems alone, but they contribute to creating demand for better journalism, which creates incentives for media organizations to provide it. What Anderson Cooper does next. There's intense speculation about Anderson Cooper's future. Several scenarios seem possible. He could stay at CNN, use his platform to advocate for reform from within, become the journalist who survived a scandal and emerged more committed to ethics. This would be the redemption arc. Whether CNN would support this, or whether it would create too much friction with corporate interests, remains to be seen. He could leave commercial media entirely, move to non-profit journalism or public broadcasting. This would be a powerful statement, giving up the prestige and income of CNN to pursue journalism without commercial pressures, would restore credibility with many critics, but would also be seen by some as running away from the fight. He could write a tell-all book exposing media practices from inside. This would be explosive and potentially heal his reputation by turning whistleblower, but it would burn bridges and end his career in mainstream media. It's a nuclear option that seems unlikely, unless he's truly done with the industry. He could retire or pivot to a different career entirely. He's financially secure and has had a long career. Maybe this is his signal to exit while he can still control the narrative. But for someone who's devoted his life to journalism, walking away would be difficult. Most likely, he stays at CNN but in a modified role, more documentary work, less daily news, projects that allow for deeper investigation and greater editorial control. A slow transition rather than a dramatic break. This allows face-saving for all parties while acknowledging things need to change. Whatever he chooses will be instructive. It will reveal whether genuine reform is possible within commercial media, or whether the system is too compromised to save. What Jasmine Crockett does next. Congresswoman Crockett faces her own choices about what comes next. She's now a national figure with significantly more influence than a typical freshman representative. How she uses that influence matters. She could focus on pushing her media transparency legislation, though it faces long odds, Make this her signature issue. Become the congresswoman known for media reform. This keeps momentum but risks being pigeonholed as a one-issue politician. She could pivot to other forms of corporate accountability, pharmaceutical pricing, financial regulation, tech monopolies. Use the credibility and platform from the Cooper confrontation to push broader reform agenda. This might be more achievable than media-specific legislation. She could use her increased national profile to seek higher office. Senate run in Texas would be challenging but not impossible with her newfound name recognition. Or position herself for national leadership roles within the Democratic Party. She could overreach, let the attention go to her head, make mistakes that undermine her credibility. This is the cautionary scenario. Many politicians who become sudden celebrities stumble when they can't handle the pressure and scrutiny. Most likely, she threads the needle, continues pushing for reform while expanding her portfolio, uses the Cooper moment as a foundation, but doesn't let it define her entirely. Builds a long-term career, rather than being a one-hit wonder. Her trajectory will tell us something about whether political courage gets rewarded or punished, whether calling out powerful institutions leads to influence or isolation. The media's self-examination. Perhaps the most important question is whether the media industry will engage in genuine self-examination, or just weather this storm like previous ones. Some positive signs. Journalism schools are teaching the Cooper case as an ethics example. Professional organizations are revising guidelines. Some news organizations are implementing stronger disclosure requirements. There's real conversation happening within the industry. But there's also cynicism. This will blow over like always, is a common sentiment among media insiders. The economic pressures remain. The corporate ownership hasn't changed. The fundamental tensions between editorial independence and business imperatives are still there. What would genuine self-examination look like? It would involve honest acknowledgement that corporate influence shapes coverage more than most journalists want to admit. Willingness to experiment with alternative business models, even if they mean lower profits. Creating institutional structures that protect editorial independence, even when it conflicts with corporate interests. Greater transparency about funding, sources, and decision-making processes. Willingness to criticize peer organizations when they fail ethically rather than circling wagons. Taking audience criticism seriously rather than dismissing it as bias or ignorance. Some organizations are doing this, many are not. The industry remains divided between those who see this as an existential crisis requiring fundamental change, and those who see it as a temporary scandal to be managed and moved past. Which faction wins will determine whether media can restore public trust, or whether trust will continue its downward spiral. As I write this script, 6 months have passed since that explosive interview. Here's where things stand. Anderson Cooper remains at CNN. His ratings have stabilized slightly below pre-scandal levels. He's doing more documentary-style pieces and fewer breaking news segments. He references the controversy occasionally, but doesn't dwell on it. The network has implemented new disclosure policies that staff call cosmetic and real in roughly equal measure. Jasmine Crockett's media transparency legislation remains in committee with no clear path to passage, but she's expanded her portfolio, working on pharmaceutical pricing, tech regulation, and campaign finance reform. Her national profile remains elevated. She's being mentioned as a potential future party leader. PharmaCorp, the company at the center of the original emails, settled multiple investigations with large fines but no admission of wrongdoing. Their stock price recovered. Their CEO kept his job. Business largely as usual, though their PR strategy is now more cautious. Several journalists have lost jobs or been reassigned in the industry-wide investigation that followed, mostly producers and researchers, rather than on-air talent. Some argue they were scapegoats. Others say accountability required consequences. Public trust in media, according to polls, continues to decline. The Cooper scandal contributed but didn't cause the trend. It's part of a broader institutional crisis that predates this particular incident. The uncomfortable truth. Here's what nobody really wants to admit. The system is working as designed. Media organizations exist within capitalism. Their purpose is to generate profit for owners and shareholders. Journalism is the product they sell, but profit is the goal. When journalistic integrity conflicts with profit maximization, profit usually wins. Not because people are evil, but because that's how the incentive structure works. This doesn't mean good journalism is impossible. Many journalists do excellent work despite these constraints. But it means that truly independent, accountability-focused journalism will always be swimming against the current. The current flows toward content that serves advertisers, doesn't alienate powerful interests, and maximizes engagement metrics. Anderson Cooper got caught in that current, so have countless other journalists. Most just don't get exposed the way he did. The emails that Jasmine Crockett revealed weren't anomalies. They were standard practice made visible. This is the uncomfortable truth that the industry doesn't want to face. The problem isn't a few bad actors or isolated ethical failures. The problem is that the business model of commercial journalism creates systematic incentives for exactly the kind of corporate influence that compromised Cooper's coverage. You can have all the ethics policies you want. You can fire producers and reassign staff. You can issue statements about commitment to independence. But if the fundamental business model remains unchanged, the incentives remain unchanged, and incentives shape behavior more powerfully than policies or good intentions. Why this story won't end. The Cooper-Crockett confrontation will be remembered as a defining moment in the crisis of American media. But it won't be the last moment. More scandals will emerge because the conditions that created this one still exist. We'll see more leaked emails showing coordination between media and corporate interests. We'll see more whistleblowers from inside news organizations. We'll see more politicians and activists exposing media failures. The tools for discovering and publicizing these failures are getting better. The incentives for doing so are getting stronger. Each scandal will be presented as isolated. This specific failure, this specific organization. But the pattern will become undeniable. Not a series of individual failures, but a systematic problem. And with each scandal, public trust will erode further, which creates its own dangers. When people stop trusting institutional media, they don't stop consuming information. They turn to alternative sources that may be less reliable, more ideological, more divorced from factual reality. We're watching the slow collapse of the mid-20th century model of professional journalism. What replaces it remains unclear. Maybe something better, more independent, more transparent, more accountable to audiences rather than advertisers. Maybe something worse, more fragmented, more partisan, more susceptible to manipulation. The Cooper scandal is a symptom of this transition. Not the cause, not the solution. Just a moment when the underlying dynamics became visible to millions of people who previously trusted that the system worked better than it actually does. The question of complicity. Here's a difficult question. Are we all complicit? As news consumers, we claim to want high-quality independent journalism, but our behavior suggests otherwise. We don't want to pay for news. We expect it to be free. We consume sensational headlines, but don't read full articles. We share stories that confirm our biases without checking facts. We demand entertainment as much as information. This consumer behavior shapes what media organizations produce. If thoughtful, nuanced, accountability journalism doesn't get views while sensational, entertaining content goes viral, what do you think gets prioritized? We complain about corporate influence on media while refusing to support alternative funding models. We want journalism free from advertising pressure, but don't subscribe to ad-free news sources. We criticize media quality while contributing to the economic pressures that degrade it. Anderson Cooper and CNN are responsible for their ethical failures, but we created the market conditions that incentivize those failures. We demanded free content, immediate updates, entertaining delivery. We got a media ecosystem optimized for those demands at the expense of depth, independence, and accountability. This isn't to absolve journalists and media organizations of responsibility. They make choices. They should be held accountable. But it is to say that we're all part of the system. Our choices as consumers matter. Our willingness or unwillingness to support quality journalism has consequences. If we want better media, we need to be better media consumers, not just critics, but supporters of the journalism we claim to value, the hope amid the wreckage. Despite all the problems, there are reasons for hope, because the collapse of the old model is creating space for experimentation with new ones. Small independent media organizations are proving that quality journalism can exist outside corporate structures. Non-profit newsrooms are doing investigative work that commercial media won't touch. Individual journalists are building direct relationships with audiences through newsletters and podcasts. Cooperative models are showing that worker ownership can protect editorial independence. These alternatives are small, fragile, uncertain, but they exist, and they're growing. The Cooper scandal, by exposing the failures of commercial media, has driven more people to support these alternatives. Subscriptions to non-profit news organizations spiked in the weeks following the interview. Donations to investigative journalism funds increased. People are voting with their dollars for the kind of media they want. Technology that exposed the problem also enables solutions. The same platforms that spread clips of the Cooper-Crockett confrontation can help independent journalists reach audiences without corporate intermediaries. The same tools that analyzed emails to find corruption can help news organizations maintain ethical standards through transparency. Young journalists entering the field are more skeptical of commercial media. They've seen the scandals. They understand the compromises. Many are choosing non-profit organizations or independent paths rather than traditional network careers. This generational shift could fundamentally transform the industry over time, and there's evidence that audiences reward authenticity. Media organizations that are transparent about their limitations, honest about their funding, and accountable when they fail often build deeper loyalty than those claiming false perfection. The path forward might involve less pretense of objectivity and more honest acknowledgement of perspective. The moment of crisis is also a moment of possibility. The question is whether we seize it, what you can do. If you've watched this far, you're clearly interested in media truth and accountability. So what can you actually do about the problems we've discussed? Support quality journalism financially. Pick one or two news organizations doing good work and subscribe. If you can afford Netflix, you can afford quality news. Local news especially needs support. Most communities have lost local newspapers. Find what's left and help it survive. Diversify your sources. Don't get all your news from one place or one perspective. Read across the political spectrum. Seek international coverage of American issues. Follow independent journalists alongside institutional media. Multiple perspectives reveal what any single source misses. Check before sharing. Social media amplifies misinformation. Before you share something, verify it. Check the source. Look for confirmation from reliable outlets. Don't spread stories just because they confirm your biases or provoke strong emotions. Engage constructively. When you see media failures, say something, but be specific and constructive. This story didn't disclose the expert's funding source is useful feedback. Mainstream media is all propaganda, is not. Journalists need to hear when they fail, but they also need actionable criticism, demand transparency, support media organizations that are open about funding, methodology, and decision-making. Question those that aren't. Transparency should be a baseline expectation, not a special virtue. Be patient with nuance. Good journalism is often complicated and uncertain. We don't know yet, or the situation is complex. Aren't failures of reporting. They're honest acknowledgements of reality. Reward media that resists oversimplification rather than punishing it for not providing simple answers. Teach media literacy. If you have kids, teach them to evaluate sources, identify bias, check facts. Media literacy is as important as traditional literacy in the modern world. Schools often don't teach it adequately, so it falls to parents and communities. Advocate for policy change. Support candidates who prioritize media reform. contact representatives about issues like antitrust enforcement against tech monopolies or funding for public media. Political change requires political action. None of these actions will fix the system alone. But collectively, millions of people making better choices as news consumers can shift the incentive structure. We can create demand for the kind of journalism we need. And where there's demand, supply will follow. The historical perspective. Let's zoom out to maximum altitude. Throughout history, societies have struggled with information quality and institutional trust. Ancient Rome had problems with propaganda and biased information sources. Medieval Europe had the Catholic Church controlling knowledge. Early modern Europe had yellow journalism and sensationalism. Each era develops information systems suited to its technology and economy. Print created newspapers. Radio and TV created broadcast networks. The internet created digital media. Each transition involves crisis as old models collapse and new ones emerge. We're living through one of those transitions. The broadcast era model of professional journalism funded by advertising is dying. It had a good run, roughly 1920 to 2010. It did important work exposing wrongdoing and informing citizens. It also had serious flaws, many of which the Cooper scandal revealed. What comes next is being determined right now. We're in the messy middle of the transition where the old is dying, but the new hasn't fully formed. It's uncomfortable, uncertain, scary for those who work in media and rely on it for information. But these transitions also create opportunities. New forms of journalism emerge. New relationships between journalists and audiences develop. New funding models prove viable. Innovation happens in crisis. Future historians will look back at the Cooper Crockett moment as one of many data points in this larger transition. They'll see it as a symptom of systemic stress, a catalyst for certain reforms, a turning point in public consciousness about media reliability. Whether they'll see it as the beginning of a renewal or the acceleration of a collapse depends on what we do next. The personal lesson. Beyond all the systemic analysis and institutional critique, there's a human lesson in this story. It's about what happens when you compromise your principles gradually, thinking each compromise is minor or justified, until suddenly you look back and realize you've traveled far from where you meant to be. Anderson Cooper probably never made a conscious decision to let corporate influence shape his journalism. It was a series of small choices, accepting one expert source suggested by PR rather than finding your own, softening one question to maintain access, dropping one follow-up to avoid conflict, each choice defensible in isolation. Together they add up to compromised journalism. This pattern applies beyond media, in careers, relationships, personal integrity. We all face constant small choices between principle and convenience, between ideals and pragmatism. Usually we choose pragmatism and tell ourselves it's fine. And usually it is fine. Until it's not, until you wake up one day and realize you've become something you didn't intend to be. The lesson isn't to be absolutist. Compromise is necessary for functioning in the real world. But it is to be conscious, to notice when you're compromising, to ask whether each compromise is necessary or just convenient, to have clear lines that you won't cross no matter what. Cooper crossed lines he probably didn't even see until Jasmine Crockett pointed them out. That's the danger. The slow erosion of standards that happens, so gradually you don't notice until someone shows you the before and after.
So the personal takeaway is, pay attention to your own small compromises. Notice when you're justifying decisions that don't sit quite right. Have people in your life who will call you out when you're rationalizing behavior that violates your values, because institutional failures start with individual compromises, multiplied across thousands of people making similar choices.
The final question. We've spent nearly 2 hours examining this story from every angle. The emails, the interview, the aftermath, the systemic problems, the possible solutions, the human costs, the historical context. But it all comes down to one question. What kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to be a society where powerful institutions can operate without meaningful accountability? Where corporate interests shape public information without transparency? Where journalism serves advertisers rather than citizens? where trust in shared institutions continues to erode until we're left with nothing but competing propaganda? Or do we want to be a society where independent journalism holds power accountable, where information sources are transparent about their funding and biases, where quality reporting is valued and supported, where institutional trust is earned through demonstrated integrity? The Cooper-Crockett confrontation forced that question into public consciousness, but the question existed before and will persist after. Every scandal, every revelation, every moment of institutional failure asks us the same thing: what are we going to do about it? Jasmine Crockett did something. She investigated, gathered evidence, and publicly confronted a powerful journalist on his own show. Agree or disagree with her politics, that took courage. She risked her reputation and career to expose what she saw as corruption. Anderson Cooper is doing something. He's wrestling with difficult questions about his career and the industry he's devoted his life to. He's under intense pressure but hasn't run from accountability. Whether what he's doing is enough is debatable, but it's something. Individual journalists at various organizations are doing something, breaking stories about institutional failures, pushing for ethical reforms, taking career risks to maintain integrity, often without recognition or reward. Media critics and watchdog organizations are doing something, analyzing coverage, exposing conflicts of interest, providing accountability for institutions that are supposed to provide accountability. And millions of people are doing something by making different choices about what media they consume and support, by demanding better, by refusing to accept the status quo. The question isn't whether change is possible. The question is whether enough of us care enough to make it happen, whether we're willing to pay the costs, financial, emotional, social, of building better systems, because maintaining the status quo is easy. It requires nothing but passivity, accepting that this is how things are and always will be. Shrugging off each new scandal as just more proof that everything's corrupt. Change is hard. It requires sustained effort, collective action, willingness to try and fail and try again. It requires believing that better is possible even when current conditions suggest otherwise. The choice before us. So here we are. You've spent considerable time learning about emails, interviews, institutional failures, and systemic problems. What now? You could close this video and forget about it. Move on to the next piece of content. File this away as interesting information but not personally relevant. That's a choice. Or you could decide that this matters, that the health of journalism and the quality of public information affects your life and your community, that you have some agency in shaping these systems, that your choices as a consumer and citizen actually matter. If you choose the second option, start small. Pick one concrete action from the list we discussed earlier. Subscribe to a quality news source. Check sources before sharing. Support a local journalist. Engage constructively with media organizations. Teach someone about media literacy. Small actions won't immediately fix systemic problems, but enough small actions, multiplied across enough people, create the conditions for larger change. Movements start with individuals making choices that seem insignificant at the time. The Cooper-Crockett story isn't just about two people confronting each other on television. It's about the choice between accepting broken systems and working to fix them, between cynicism and engagement, between passivity and agency. Which will you choose? The story continues. As I finish writing this script, new developments are emerging. Another media organization faces questions about corporate influence. Another whistleblower is coming forward with documents. Another journalist is being held accountable for ethical failures. Another politician is pushing for reform. The story that began with 3 emails and a 36-minute interview continues to reverberate. It's spawned investigations, legislation, career changes, and countless conversations about what journalism should be.